Our next guest is Tomas Lamanauskas, managing partner from Envision Associates. Thomas has more than 20 years of international career in digital public policy and regulation, including as a head, deputy head, and board member of number of national regulatory authorities in Europe, Lithuania, Middle East, and Caribbean, senior government in another one in the Pacific, head of corporate strategy in the ITU, advisor in the Envision, and number of other companies. He has a tremendous experience as demonstrator and speaker, and with more than 200 speaking roles in events held in more than 40 countries all over the world. My pleasure to introduce Tomas Lamanauskas, managing partner from Envision Associates, and his terrific topic on the data management and data regulation. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Mindaugas. And it's really a pleasure to speak this morning here, and after this very inspiring conversation with Dr. Anka Verkan, and really picking up from there. And I think, so there are a couple of things I will also would like to say, which is maybe provocative for the beginning. So one is, the title of the session is called Privacy After Schrems 2 and Brexit. And my first thought, and most probably, I'll try to prove that through my presentation, that most probably these are not the two forces that will be the most influential on privacy in going forward and privacy regulation going forward. And what I'll try to cover in this intervention is basically how, from the global perspective, what are these forces that drive privacy regulation around the world, and what changes we can see going forward especially as we navigate different jurisdictions. And this was very interesting to hear from Dr. Karukan the phrase "don't trust government," but this becomes much more interesting when you deal not just with the government, but with a lot of governments, and then you have to navigate this landscape, as a lot of international lawyers have to do, and kind of see how different multinational companies especially have to navigate issues and aspects across the globe. So just a little bit of statistics to start with. So as per United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, around 66% of countries worldwide have data protection legislation. 10% have draft laws, and 19% no laws in place, and some information is missing, of course, when you take the statistics. However, not having a law doesn't mean you're not regulated, and doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want. Actually, from my experience working across the borders, when there is no law in the country, it's usually much more complicated, because there's some regulations, there are some enforcement practices, there are some license provisions, and as a business, then we need to navigate all those. So sometimes as regulators' opinions, all those, when we try to navigate what data can be transferred, how data could be managed, and all that. So actually, having a law is already good, and not having a law is already creating a lot of, let's say, uncertainties. However, having said that, not every country adopts the law for the same reason, and even the same countries adopt the law for conflicting reasons sometimes. So it is, of course, privacy protection, and that was covered by the previous speaker. That's kind of overarching need to protect privacy as a, I would say, human right. Yeah? So, and we have that, especially in the European Union, that's a strong overriding principle and strong overriding force. And then we have other places, like especially US, California, that picks up that mantle and also tries to do the same thing. However, there are other reasons. For example, controlling tech giants. So now more and more privacy is now as a part of the argument whether the big tech companies are not too big, and whether what they do is not too impactful for our life and too concentrated. And we have these big processes, especially picking up like last year in the United States with the Congress investigation, with the European Union, with the Digital Service Act, Digital Markets Act, in China with the anti-competition investigations against their own tech giants, looking if they are not too big, So it's not just, let's say, Western phenomenon. You have another thing that sometimes we avoid talking about is national security and law enforcement needs. And of course, when we say that, we always think, okay, China, Russia, data localization. But however, Russia, let's say US is also having that as a big argument. We had this big discussion about US Cloud Act. What can you do? What can't you do? We have a lot of companies that don't want to store the data in the US soil as well, so because of certain reasons. And we have certain companies that are looking for jurisdictions, for that. At the same time, a lot of countries are very concerned not to lose access to the data. So how, is, of course, we're seeing from that side, okay, censorship and intervention, but there's another side, there's a law enforcement legitimate needs. So what do you as a law enforcement officer do if, let's say, someone uses Gmail and communicates with a criminal intent? How can you access that? And we know there's a still huge problem, so-called MLATs, legal assistance treaty-based requests are not really working. They take months, and then the simpler solutions are invented, let's say, on the European side, within European Union, with e-evidence regulations, but it doesn't exist on a global scale. So that's why naturally some countries say, look, I want that on my shores. I want my country's data on my shores. At least I know I'll have access to that. There's also, of course, national economy industrial policy piece, So let's say, especially seen like in India, where you can kind of see like a big local giants now taking the hold with, and like Reliance Geo, attracting investments from big Western giants, and partly data localization drive and data regulation drivers, sometimes to give a leg up to those local giants. And we see the same in Russia, China, some countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and you see like even European Union, that narrative somehow forming, so that about local industry. And finally, last but not least, taxation, so countries want the piece of the cake, and you have, of course, attempts to tax digital players directly, like some OECD countries do, like UK imposed, France, Spain, Italy, digital services tax. But also some countries try to do that indirectly through mandating localization, through mandating local registration. So that these players will be in the country. So there's different drives, and different results. It's interesting to see what the quote from President Macron when he says, we have what we call GAFA in the US, so Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. We have BATX, so Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, Xiaomi in China. But we have GDPR in Europe, So that just shows what each kind of region prioritizes, and I think being from Europe, we can see that Europe, even though there's this, let's say, discussion about industrial policy and helping local players, it's not always results in that. So what does this result? Also, one like a perspective. How does this result internationally? What do we see internationally? Is every country equal? When we talk. So I would say there are three groups of countries. So the countries that can regulate and can, in some ways, impose their own rules. So it's US, European Union, China. So there's the countries that, for example, as the President of the European Union and China, even are seeking extraterritorial imposition of rules. With EU with GDPR, China with this, for now, draft data protection law that's also imposes very similar rules like GDPR, and in a way has some extraterritorial impact. Countries that kind of can do, but only for themselves, like India and Russia. So they regulate, but they mostly impact local internal market, especially because they're not such a big, what some people call internet exporters. So their internet business doesn't go abroad that much, but it's pretty big. They're pretty big by themselves to be able to regulate internal data markets, if you will. And then everyone else, and some countries, and funny, some countries think they can do, like Indonesia, for example, and with the data localization initiatives, they had to roll it back and basically said, oh, maybe we can't really do it, So so if Indonesia, and then Pakistan is similar, so if Indonesia, Pakistan, countries with, 200 million of people really struggle to do that, of course, what does it mean for everyone else? That basically you're a bit of in a control or in those storm of whatever everyone else is doing. So in a way, I think, especially speaking from Lithuanian perspective, it's good for Lithuania to be part of the European Union, that at least we have some control of like what are the data privacy laws that we abide, and not just kind of have to adopt what giants are doing. What is the result? So what are the results across the world? So you see those, you see GDPR, in terms of legislation taking hold as a kind of de facto standard to adopt, with some modifications, but even people are looking at that. And even when you look at laws in China and India, they take it as a base and then modify, rather than kind of reinvent the wheel. Not always, it doesn't mean good, because what does it mean GDPR? If GDPR was adopted by every country, that means with the extraterritorial aspect of GDPR, that means conflicting jurisdictions of many countries, So, and it's not always really, the best benefit for the business. It's also And, there's also discussion, and maybe some people will cover, big versus small and how that impacts different countries, different players and all that. There's also, conflicts and overlapping laws, and what I touched. Also, where some countries don't have laws and regulation, so therefore it's a lot of uncertainty still. And it's like even a industry term called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, which actually regulates how businesses behave as much sometimes as formal laws, just trying to be precautious, especially in regulated areas like health or critical infrastructure or financial sector, where the businesses really try to comply with something, in there's nothing. And then another thing is just important to have in mind that theory and practice doesn't always match. So sometimes countries announce big localization initiatives. Whether they really implement that's another matter. Sometimes regions announce harmonization initiatives. Whether data really can flow, that's also another matter. Like APEC has a privacy framework out of 20, so Asia Pacific Economic Community, out of 21 countries, only 3 countries abide by it. And also, but the same with the shrimps too, and kind of talking to a lot of experts. Yes, it's important from the legal perspective when we have a lot of interesting legal discussions and some fees for lawyers, and great for TGS Baltic and others, But in practice, we all know the EU will never cut itself off of the US kind of digital giants, and the recommendation will be found, and basically data will keep flowing, So we just need to go, and sorry for saying a bit properly, through motions for that, So, and then of course, with the Brexit was there. So of course, we see now that despite potential concerns, as it was announced, I think late last week or this week, UK is getting adequacy decision, and also basically they will be resolved. So COVID, and just very briefly, so what is COVID? So I think Anne, Dr. Anne really well covered this kind of contract tracking and tracing, information gathering aspect of COVID. There are a couple of other aspects. One is everything is moving online. So over the last year, the cloud services grew by 33% year-on-year growth. So it's huge, So that's the main industry that's really benefiting in COVID-19 times. The countries that were trying to go, data localization and all that and prevent cloud players, they see, look, we need the government services online. We need everything online. So that's why they're becoming much more flexible. So it's move online. On the other hand, this digital sufficiency so-called move, it's like, hey, we need to have this working, and you have that, of course, in places like Russia, with let's say, internet sovereignty concepts, but then you have places like Australia where, they say, look, our health data needs to be in Australia, because that's very critical for us, So you have these different forces that COVID will impact, and how it will impact, we'll see. So just to finish it, so what we'll see going forward, and I think how these all forces kind of is merging together. So one is, we'll see fragmented world. We'll see the world which is not easy to navigate. When we're in European Union and discuss it, and then when we discuss maybe flows between European Union and US, so it's fine, But when you go beyond that, it's complicated, So know what is probably, and a lot of people say, if you want to do business in China, you localize in China, basically not just kind of where you hold data, but where you have people who work with data, where you have your data centers, everything, you localize there, because it's so more difficult to kind of straddle those jurisdictions. If you want to work somewhere else, you have to look what are the conflicted jurisdictions, where your clients are from, not only where you are, but where your clients are from, where your flows are going, what's your cloud services provider, where they host a service. And it's no longer really the public cloud now, you have to know still where your data is there, so it's public, but still localized. You have some alliances, and there's a lot of discussion about US and Europe and how they will kind of find accommodations, whether they will manage to cross the differences, and US becoming more, let's say, privacy conscious, and EU maybe allowing or being more open about national security needs, let's say, because some European countries are pretty, for them, it's national security needs are as important as US, but being more open about it, can there be accommodation? And there will also be bilateral arrangements, like Japan-EU free trade agreement that allows for pretty strong data flows provisions, So we'll see this complicated. Can we have a grand solution that kind of resolves that on a global basis? Probably not. So it's not a good thing for businesses that travel abroad and kind of want to do that. I think it's maybe with that, it's a great news for lawyers, that kind of advise those businesses. So thank you, Mindaugas. With that, some of the comments from me this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas, for terrific insights. And from my side, really navigating through the landscape, especially, regulatory landscape for multinational company is such a big headache. On the other hand, it's a big, advantage to consultants, and not advantage, but basically
Sure.
plenty of work for us.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, uh, without irony, my question maybe would be the following: is the data localization principle in itself adequate? I mean, meaning that sometimes it's impossible to say where the data is exactly located, or in other words, there are so many places where the data can be located physically and geographically at the same time. Is it this notion at all not the 19th century notion, data location, where the data is located? Is it at all possible to apply effectively?
I think, regretfully or not, it's becoming more and more real concept again. I think we had this wild west approach, or maybe good approach, or the idealistic approach, or we said public cloud is public cloud and data is wherever it is, but the cloud is composed of servers, like which are kind of based in some data centers, and increasingly companies, when they sign agreements, even with the giants like AWS or Microsoft Azure, they know where the data will be, and they know exactly where the data won't be, so then, and the companies abide by that, We even have in Europe, if you look at the telecom sector in Europe and now in Germany, announcements, like Germany wants some data in Germany, and even if it's not required localization, this offered localization as a service, So this becomes more and more, and I think in some countries, companies that provide localization become like a more compliant. Now, there's also these different flavors, the so-called hard localization, where data can only be in the country, soft localization, where data has to be in the country but can be abroad. So I think it's, in the reality, it's like it's all muddled, so it's not like data will really be there, and will not go anywhere. So you'll always find accommodations to do the business around. But clearly, in the kind of principle level, this localization or knowing where your data is, regretfully, in this world of conflicting laws, will become an imperative. And I see the industry adapting to that. For better or worse, it's not great probably from cost level. Of course, if you're a smaller country and trying to attract international businesses like Lithuania, you most probably want to be more flexible with that. But if you're China, you can afford it, and you'll ask for it.
Okay, Thomas, thank you very much for being with us. That was Tomas
Thank you very much.
Lamanauskas from Envision.